Anyway, my name is Hiroki. I want to make many friends today and tomorrow, so please be friendly to me. But please be critical to my presentation in order to push the discussion on transnationalism and post-colonialism further in a collective way. Yeah, anyway, let's get started. Anyway, I had a good sleep yesterday, so my brain's working right now, so okay. Yeah, my talk today is Art as Decolonization, Zainichi Korean art since the 2000s. The people called Zainichi Koreans currently constitute one of the largest ethnic minority groups in Japan, and Shin-Okubo, an extensive Korean town located in its capital, symbolizes the transnational nature of contemporary Tokyo. Nevertheless, their presence, barely known not only in the West, but also within the country itself, suggests that there are still a lot of issues regarding ethnicity and nationality which Japan has to face in an increasingly complex period of transnationalism. The aim of this presentation is to investigate a possibility for art to make a unique contribution to the important task of decolonization by analyzing artistic practices by Zainichi Koreans since the 2000s. Let me briefly explain the reason why I focus on the period of the 2000s. The year 2002 was a momentous period for the relationship between Japan and Korea. Actually, two historical events that happened in the year deeply impacted on the feelings of Japanese and Korean people toward each other. One is a FIFA World Cup co-hosted by South Korea and Japan. To be sure, the first World Cup in Asia, which attracted a great number of visitors from all over the world, was a big success, both economically and diplomatically. However, psychological tension between the Japanese and South Koreans arose due to unexpected matters such as dispute over tournament's name or controversial victories of the South Korean national team. Another influential event of 2002 was the first Japan-North Korea Summit Conference. In September of the year, Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro visited Pyongyang to confer with President Kim Jong-il. Pyongyang is the capital of North Korea. And where am I? In the meeting, the North Korean government admitted that it had abducted a number of Japanese students during the 1970s and 1980s and officially apologized for the crime. This became another trigger for extensive anti-Korean sentiment among the Japanese public. In a broader context, including these events, as many sociologists argue, hostility toward resident Koreans became more extreme in Japan in the early 2000s. There are three questions I would like to address in this presentation. First, I will define the word decolonization. Second, I will explain what the term Zainichi Koreans refer to and foreground the historical and contemporary problems surrounding them. Thirdly, and mainly, I will closely look into how artists have tackled contested issues concerning Zainichi Koreans. According to a dictionary, decolonization can be defined as the act or the process of eliminating colonialism or freeing from colonial status. Historically, a great many struggles for freedom from colonial occupation have been waged in different places and at different times. Therefore, Robert Young divides the chronology of decolonization into three, like this. However, this definition needs an essential modification in the current setting, because most of former colonies all over the world, including Japan's EX colonies, such as Korea and Taiwan, are formally independent today. Thus, Indian post-colonial theorist Ashish Nandi asserts that we have to fight against the second form of colonialism that colonize, quote, our minds in addition to bodies. Given this fact, Taiwanese cultural studies scholar Chen Kanshin redefines the term decolonization as a painstaking effort of the previously colonized to set up a new subjectivity. Likewise, Walter Mignolo, Argentine semiotician, reorients the scope of decolonization. Significant is that the focus of what he calls decoloniality is epistemological. Simply put, in my understanding, for Mignolo, the project of decolonization is disclosing the logic of colonialism, still dominating our mind in many respects, in order to disconnect it from our way of thinking. Furthermore, Sakai Naoki's reconfiguration of the meaning of post-coloniality is particularly insightful to establish the definition of decolonization in the context of this presentation. Sakai recounts the concept of post-coloniality is characterized by the very impossibility of envisaging identities prior to the experience of colonization. This indicates that the indispensability of creating an alternative knowledge, discourse, and representation over post-colonial subjectivity, at the same time emancipated from and emancipating the lasting legacy of colonialism in the current world. From what has been discussed so far, I shall now draw the definition of decolonization in the context of this talk. Art as decolonization I am now conceptualizing here is basically advanced in three ways. First, it reconstitutes ethnic identity by postulating flexible concept of heterogeneity instead of fixed notion of homogeneity. Second, it deterritorializes the nationalized domain of memory by inserting the transnational historicity. Third, it produces alternate platforms where discussion and dialogue on current issues of contested history could be embarked differently. The case study in this presentation are works created by two Dainichi Korean artists and a couple of exhibitions held in Tokyo. Both Ohaji and Kumsoni were born and raised in Japan and emerged as promising young artists in the early 2000s. Since then, they have made experimental works seeking a new representation of identity and interventional performances challenging dominant perception on ethnicity. In the 2010s, the succeeding generations of Korean artists in Japan, most of whom were university students at that time, organized exhibitions featuring the work of Dainichi Korean, such as Dainichi, the Present, and the Art, and suddenly the view spreads out before us. Remarkably, some of those exhibitions were realized in collaboration with Japanese artists of the same generation. The term Dainichi Korean widely refers to Koreans living in Japan as long-term foreign residents, and the majority of Koreans in Japan traces their roots to Korea under Japanese rule. Japan was a former imperial power that invaded other Asian countries from the late 19th century up to the Second World War. In the history of an expanding empire, Japan colonized Korea by force for 3.5 decades from 1910 to 1945. When the war ended, according to cultural anthropologist Sonia Liam, there were more than 2 million Koreans living in Japan. And according to the survey reported by the Ministry of Justice Homsho in 2016, there are approximately 500,000 Koreans residing in Japan. The post-war history of Dainichi Koreans can be understood as a long history of oppression. Although Koreans under Japanese colonization were forcibly incorporated into the body of imperial citizens and mobilized for Japan's war of aggression, they abruptly lost certain citizenship rights, for instance, their voting rights after the war. As soon as Japan regained political autonomy under the San Francisco Peace Treaty, the government unilaterally deprived Dainichi Koreans of Japanese nationality, which the Empire of Japan had once imposed on them. Therefore, many Dainichi Koreans had been in substance stateless, at least until 1965, when the diplomatic relation between Japan and South Korea was normalized in that year. In addition, they have suffered from discrimination and inequality in the post-war Japanese society, although so-called Korea booms have visited a number of times in the past 20 years. Koreans in Japan have been, to borrow the expression of Melissa Bender, more often object of discrimination or ridicule than of envy or fascination. since 1945 onward. It is worthwhile pointing out in the post-war history of Japanese art, there is a critical lack of works dealing with post-colonial issues, including that of Zainichi Korean. There are exceptions, of course. Dainichi series made by Takamine Tadasu between 2003 and 2004, which comprises 3 works, A Lover from Korea, A Korean Studies, and Baby in the Dawn, is one of the few artistic responses to the contentious issue of Zainichi Korean. Okay, Ohaji is a 3rd generation of Zainichi Korean born in the late 1970s. Trained as a textile artist, she uses a wide range of techniques of weaving, dyeing, and stitching in her works. In the early 2000s, O created textile pieces by combining several different techniques in search of new expression of ethnic identity. In Wedding Dress for Minority Race, for example, she recreated a Japanese kimono into the dress for Korean hanbok style to be worn at weddings. Additionally, the red undercloth beneath the dress was made of the fabric for kimono called nagajuban. Cutting, stitching, and restyling a kimono all transformed the traditional Japanese dress into an artistic representation of hybridity in identity of ethnic minority. In Roots, she made in the same year, through the creation of an original costume, or continued to address the difficult question of identity, both personal and ethnic, simultaneously. She used chimachogori, a conventional Korean outfit for women that consists of a pair of jacket and skirt, as a central motif of this work, and printed and stitched the family tree of her paternal side. In Sanga, which she created in 2005, the hybridity in her woven garment seems to be further complicated. To borrow the word of the artist herself, in her pursuit of an ethnic dress which might or may have existed somewhere, the dress was composed of a set of jacket and skirt like Korean chimachogori, but at the same time, it was stylized for Japanese kimono and had a distinctive China dress-like color. In this installation piece, the dress was accompanied by organdy curtain, many pieces of petal-shaped silk on which words from old Korean songs were printed, and a television monitor continuously showing her hands weaving the dress. Memory is also an important subject in Ohaji's artworks. 3 Generations and the 3 Generations of Time, both made in 2004, can be interpreted as her attempt to access the memory of her grandmother, who was the 1st generation of Zainichi Korean, and her mother, who is the 2nd generation. 3 Generations is a photographic work composed of 3 self-portraits of the artist. For this work, O visited the Jeju Island, the ancestral home of her grandmother, who passed away in 2001. At this island, O took portrait of herself bearing 3 different chimachogori, that is, her grandmother's one, her mother's one, and the one she made newly. In light of Marianne Hirsch's idea of post-memory, Rebecca Jennison understands 3 Generations of Time as a forward-looking effort to construct her own narrative through the act of digging up stories of previous generations with a deep personal connection. In her subsequent 3 Generations of Time, she printed these photographs repeatedly on the Korean fabric called sanbe, which is also used for the costume at funerals. The long sequence of photographs, it seems to me, represents the continuity and intricate entanglement of the memories of different generations, radically calling linear views on history into question. Entitled Grandmother Island Project, Ohaji's new endeavor aims to celebrate and share individually singular histories as memories detached from a fixed frame of nations. Grandmother Island is the name of the place for different forms of memory. An installation exhibited in Kyoto this year, a nautical map, consisted first part of this project. Using a traditional Guatemalan technique, she created textile pieces without cutting the warp, the metaphor of a new modality of memory, a memory always in the making. O expresses this project as an imaginary and multi-sensory species that reveals the interconnectedness between untold stories. Born in Okay. Born in 1980, Kum Soni is also a third generation of Zainichi Korean who grew up in the North Korean community in Japan. Through politically charged artistic practices deeply informed by critical feminist theory, Kum has tried to deconstruct the master narrative of national history, casting a new light on those silenced in the process of modern nation building. It is important to note that in the wake of anti-Korean sentiment, there were several cases in which female Zainichi students wearing chimachogori used as a uniform of Korean ethnic schools in Japan became outstanding targets of nationalist violence in the 2000s when Kum made Beast of Me, I shall now discuss. The video work focusing on the vulnerability of Korean women in Japan consists of 5 segments, all of which are seemingly disconnected but substantially very relevant each other. In the second part, the artist wearing chimachogori seated on the grass. In this scene, Kum narrates in Japanese almost in a whispering manner how Zainichi Koreans have been marginalized in Japanese society, in company with bilingual voiceovers in English and Korean. I should emphasize the threefold meaning of chimachogori she wears in this memorable shot. In addition to a stimulant to female Koreans' vulnerability, as I discussed, it is at the same time a symbol of resistance against assimilation policy in Japan. There is moreover the third meaning in Kum's usage of the traditional Korean dress in Beast of Me, in my view. It is evident in the narration that her mother's proposal to temporarily stop the use of chimachogori, which make female students easily identifiable targets of hostility directed to Koreans, was immediately rejected by Zainichi Korean men. That is to say, Kum also symbolizes the dress as a burden of representation asymmetrically shared by female Zainichi Koreans in order to question the patriarchal thought of their male counterparts. At the beginning of 4th section, Kum abruptly inserts the shot of a flock of goat and sheep feeding on the grass on a hillside, when realizing that the voice heard behind the shot were those of the victims of notorious U.S. nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. We come to understand a common thread between the 2 segments I was just now introduced here, which is a different forms of relentless violence configuring our contemporary world. All in all, Beast of Me persistently revolves around the question over the post-war New World orders established at the sacrifice of countless scapegoats suppressed by varying forms of colonial and post-colonial barbarity. Despite an approach different from all, Kum addressed the subject concerning her personal memory and public history as well. For example, Falling Sky, made in 2005, is an experimental film composed of several different historical documents. To deconstruct the normative narrative of history, Kum amalgamates these archival materials and the personal story of the artist herself growing up as an ethnic minority in Japan. In the film, she dealt with the issue of the Korean War in the early 1950s, which evinces actual influence of the Cold War in East Asia. I would like to concentrate on the scene in order to foreground her representational tactic for forging a new way to address the issue of ethnic minority. She superimposed a scene cited from Oshima Nagisa's Death by Hanging, Koshuke, a story of a Zainichi Korean condemned criminal, on a shot of the body of a Jewish artist whom she collaborated to make this film, implying the history of oppression shared by the 2 ethnic groups. It seems to me that Kum in Falling Sky seeks an alternate mode of solidarity that connects fragmented history of the oppressed. Finally, I mentioned exhibitions of the 2010s organized by the new generation of Zainichi Korean artists. The first example is Zainichi, the Present and the Art, held at 8 Eiko, a contemporary art gallery in Tokyo in 2014. According to Chon Yu-gyeon, who took a central role in the organization of this exhibition, most of the galleries which he contacted to realize a show featuring works of Zainichi Korean artists expressed a little interest in his proposal, apart from Kibukawa A, owner of 8 Eiko. As its title clearly suggests, Zainichi, the Present and the Art aimed to raise the issue of Zainichi Korean in the domain of contemporary art. In a newspaper interview, one of the participating artists, Lee Jong-ok, stated that it was meaningful for her to challenge the exclusivity of the Japanese art world as a Zainichi Korean artist. This means mounting the politically charged exhibition in Tokyo itself is a valuable challenge to increase visibility of Zainichi Korean. For John, who curated this show, its primary purpose was not to make his own political stance known to the public, but to construct an alternative platform where questions on ethnic identity could be openly and differently discussed through a whole variety of artworks. In 2015, an exhibition titled Suddenly the View Spreads Out Before Us took place at Musashino University and Korea University in Tokyo. Realized in collaboration between Zainichi Korean and Japanese art students, this show originally started as a joint project of making a bridge crossing the wall between two adjacent colleges. The collective action of building a bridge instead of removing the wall itself can be interpreted as a metaphor of their will to embark on dialogue, at the same time acknowledging the psychological and realistic gap separating the Japanese and Zainichi Koreans. Actually, the documentation of conversation made among participating artists with different ethnic backgrounds was also displayed together with individual works. Art critic Sawaragi Noi notes that what this challenging exhibition made visible was an asymmetrical relationship between the Japanese and Zainichi Koreans, which still exists in Japanese society. It should not be overlooked that at the core of the asymmetry, there is an uneven power relation between the Japanese as majority and Zainichi Koreans as ethnic minority. This show was developed into the other side of the boundaries exhibition held at the Tokyo Metropolitan Art Museum this year. So this is a kind of ongoing project. In the conclusion, in recent years, social problems regarding various ethnic minority in Japan have been more and more visible. The refugees from Southeast Asia and Japanese Brazilian workers are conspicuous examples among them. Accordingly, in the field of art, it is becoming more important to re-examine the post-war, post-colonial history of Zainichi Korean artists, which has been largely neglected for a long time. Re-evaluating their discursive practices would enable us to discover the singular possibility for art to intervene in the current issues surrounding ethnic minorities in diverse ways. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.